My name is Richard Ebert, and sitting with me is my brother Robert Ebert. We're here today to discuss his career, both personal and professional. I will be asking him some questions that are of importance and interest. The first question is related to our family. We were brought up together as young people. We shared the same intellectual, professional, and social influences, and we've been very close together, or close all of our lives. Perhaps you might have some reflections on our family and how it influenced your career.
Well, I think it had a profound influence. Our father was a physician scholar and also a companion to us. Our mother was a compassionate person who made a congenial and a secure home for us. You and I, because we were close in age and also because we had a rather peripatetic youth, because our father moved around a good deal, became really closer, I suppose, than most brothers do. And that firm friendship has lasted the rest of our lives. I think also because you were the older brother and the real scholar in the family, you always were a role model to me. So I had a number of mentors in the family.
What lessons did you learn from your experiences in our home that affected your subsequent professional career?
I think there were a number of them. Perhaps most important was the feeling that one was expected to do the best one can and compete with oneself rather than with others. I learned a respect for scholarship. I learned the virtue of debate as a way of clarifying issues in one's mind. I learned the importance of compassion for others. I suppose one of the most important lessons I learned was that it was more important what your background of knowledge was and how you could work with others than what title was. And finally, that research could enliven the enjoyment of a professional career.
Do you remember Dr. Steakman, who was professor of plant pathology at the University of Minnesota and subsequently president of the AAAS, and who is a close friend of our father? Actually, they came from the same community at the same time, the University of Minnesota. He'd been a visitor frequently in our home. Do you have any thoughts about him?
Well, I think he had an influence on both of us. I think that our lives crossed again when I was on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, because he had been a consultant to that foundation. He was really one of the chief architects of the so-called Green Revolution, and George Harrar, who was then the president of the foundation, had been a student of Steakman's, and so yes, I think he influences both early on and influenced me later on in life.
We both attended the University of Chicago High School, which was founded as part of the laboratory school of the University of Chicago by John Dewey, a famous philosopher and educator. Did your experiences in that school have any influence on your subsequent career?
Well, I think that it did. I think I learned there to organize my thoughts. I learned basically how to study because it was a school in which you were expected to participate. I learned a lot about how to write and how to speak. I learned later on that Flexner was a great admirer of Dewey's and was a proponent of progressive education. I think people forget that progressive education didn't mean an undisciplined education, but it really meant self-discipline and self-reliance, and I think I learned that there.
After that, you attended the University of Chicago as an undergraduate. When did you decide to enter medical school, or when did you become interested in medicine?
Well, I was interested in medicine, but I really hadn't decided when I entered as an undergraduate. Because I'd had a fair amount of academic work at the high school, I was able to finish 2 years in the first year of college, and so I had some extra time. And I took all of the courses that were necessary for getting into medical school, but I also took pre-law courses because I thought that I might go to law school. But I finally, in my third year, decided on medical school, and I took my first year of medicine as my last year of college.
You were awarded a Rhodes Scholarship the first year you attended medical school. How did you happen to apply?
Well, I think partly because a man named Sheldon Teft, who was a law professor who was in charge of the competition at the University of Chicago, he persuaded me to apply. I had reasonably good grades. I had been active in student affairs, particularly in the Drama Association, and I had visited Oxford on a bicycle trip in 1935, so I decided to apply, feeling nothing would be lost if I didn't get it.
I know while you were at Oxford that you earned a PhD, or as they call it in England, a DPhil. Did you know that you might take a course in the doctoral course when you first entered Oxford?
No, I had not. I had expected to do what most Rhodes Scholars did, which was to take another BA degree. I would have taken one in physiology. I applied to Magdalen College because Sir Charles Sherrington, who was a famous physiologist, had been a member of that college. And it was only after I got there that I decided to do a DPhil.
What was the relation of Magdalen College to Oxford University?
Well, it has to be remembered that Oxford really had started as a medieval university, and most of the life of the university revolved around the colleges, which were independently founded and had their own independent endowment. Indeed, it was kind of a loose federation of colleges that made up the university. And it was really only with the evolution of major science in the 19th century and 20th century that the university became increasingly important, because you obviously can't have laboratories in every one of the colleges. But still, a good deal of the teaching revolved around the colleges.
What was the undergraduate curriculum like at Oxford?
Well, it was very different than ours. It was expected that in secondary education, and most of them went to so-called public schools, which were really private schools, such as Eton and Harrow and Winchester. It was expected that one would have a general education, and therefore, by the time a student got to Oxford, and I say he because there were very few women at that time in the major colleges, was expected to concentrate, in this case in physiology. And the person concentrating in physiology would, in the 3-year curriculum, would also do much of what we expect a student to have done in the first year of medical school, namely biochemistry, anatomy, histology, and pathology. It's led me to feel that we could do a great deal to kind of integrate the last years of college and the first year or two of medical school and save some time, something which Flexner was very much in favor of.
What was the undergraduate teaching like?
Well, lectures were considered really not very important, and the major teaching was done in tutorial. During the one term that I did start doing a BA degree, I had as my tutor a man named John Eccles, who, as you know, subsequently earned the Nobel Prize. And there were 3 other students in my group, and each week each of us would write an essay on some assigned topic, which meant going to the literature and really writing a critical review of the work being done in that particular area. And then 1 or 2 of us would present that, and it would be criticized. And needless to say, Jack Eccles was not a person who gave bouquets about one's work easily. It was a very interesting time.
How did you arrange to work with Professor Flory?
Well, a man named James Goodfriend, who was a Rhodes Scholar, was working in the lab at that time, and he took me over to his lab and suggested that I meet with Flory. I also met with a number of the other people there, including Peter Medewer and his wife Jean Medewer, who were both working in the lab. And I subsequently went back and asked Flory if I could work there, and things were done informally in those days, and he accepted me as a DPhil student.
Did you work directly with him?
Yes, I did. I first started out working with Jean Medewer, culturing lymphocytes and tissue culture, lymphocytes for the thoracic duct. Flory had an enormous interest in the role of the lymphocyte, which of course has turned out to be an enormously important cell, and nobody knew what it did at that time. And he did all sorts of experiments trying to find out. Actually, it was ultimately Gowans working in that lab who made some of the first breakthroughs. But in any case,
That was your doctoral thesis?
Well, what I specifically worked on was on the relationship of the monocyte, the blood monocyte, to fixed tissue histiocyte in a macrophage. And although it had been suspected these were either the same cell or similar cells, we were able to demonstrate by tagging the monocyte with India ink that had been injected intravenously. We were able to demonstrate by watching individual monocytes migrate through the venule endothelium that they were transformed into macrophages and then finally into tissue histiocytes, so that by following individual cells, we were able to demonstrate that it was the same cell in different periods of development.
You know, Flory has become a public figure since he received the Nobel Prize for his work on penicillin, and I think it would be of interest to know how he was to work with, what kind of a person he was.
Well, he was a remarkable person to work with. First of all, he had an incisive and critical mind. He never accepted anything by rote. He particularly skeptical of physicians, and although he was an MD himself, who we call pill pushers, because he felt so much of medicine was just based on tradition rather than on scientific evidence. And he insisted on scientific evidence for anything that had to do with pathogenesis. He was trained as a physiologist by Sherrington and then as a histologist by Cajal in Spain, and so he was not trained as a pathologist, but he turned out to be an extraordinary experimental pathologist.
Was it a congenial place to work, the laboratory?
Yes, he was. Flory was an Australian, and there were a number of other Australians in the lab, so it was a rather less formal place than probably many labs in Oxford in those days. We all had tea together at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and those were interesting discussions, both scientific and, of course, political, because those are the days of the Spanish Civil War, of Hitler, Mussolini, of Chamberlain, because this was the time of the false peace between 1938 and 39, and so there were some pretty vigorous discussions going on about the political events at that time.
Not only that, but Great Britain entered the war while you were there. How did this impact on your career there?
Well, I decided to speed up my work a little bit, but I did finish my thesis. It was an interesting time to be in the lab, though, because a number of people who had not expected to be there stayed. Flory had been interested in starting work on penicillin. He and Shane had worked on something called lysozyme, which was a naturally occurring agent that lysed bacteria, but unfortunately just non-pathogens. And he became interested in penicillin, which had been reported, as you know, by Fleming in 1939, but really nothing had been done with it because it was so unstable. Heatley, who had planned to go to the Carlsberg laboratory, he was a biochemist, was asked by Flory to develop some way of quantitating or calibrating penicillin, and he developed the Oxford unit by the method of these little discs and the lysis around the disc. Then penicillin was grown in any container that could be found in that lab to try to accumulate enough to treat some animals, which they finally did. So it was an interesting time to be there to watch that development.
Well, it was a historic moment,
It
too,
was.
because penicillin was the first effective antibiotic.
That's right.
Who were your doctoral examination?
Well, LeGros Clark was a professor of anatomy, and then Sally Zuckerman, who later became a very important figure in the MRC and other affairs of state.
Did they treat you all right?
They did indeed, very nicely.
What are your most vivid memories of Oxford?
Well, I think two. One is the friendships that were made, and some of these have lasted a lifetime. I think the other way he was working with Florey, who probably influenced me more than anyone else that I've ever worked with, he was really a remarkable person. He not only oversaw everything that went on in the lab, but he worked directly with me. He never put his name on a paper in which he had not participated in the experimental work and had reviewed all of the work himself. A lesson that might be learned by some of the investigators in this country.
I think so. I know that you were married at Oxford, and I think you met Emily there,
Yes.
actually, and then were married. Then went back to the University of Chicago and finished up medical school. Did you have to give up your research while you were in medical school there?
No, I was able to continue some research while I was there. I worked in the Department of Pathology. Paul Cannon, who was then the head of pathology, was very kind and very helpful to me. We did agree on things scientific. I would say we didn't agree very much on things political. I had become an Anglophile. I was, by having observed what was going on in Europe and having visited in Germany and Italy during the time of the Nazis and the fascists, was absolutely convinced that we were ultimately going to be in the war. Paul Cannon was convinced that we ought to stay out of Europe.
America first.
And America first, and was certainly didn't like Franklin Roosevelt very much, and I admired him. But this was all done without rancor, and he was very supportive of me.
I knew him. He was a nice man.
Very nice man.
I think you picked Boston City Hospital for your residency. As you know, I was had my residency there, or internship. Did it have any influence on your choosing Boston City?
Well, I think it did. I think without any question, your experience there influenced me. The other thing that influenced me was the fact that Bill Castle had come to Oxford to visit and came over to the lab, and I met him there. Of course, he knew you. And I hadn't realized at the time that he was being considered for the Nuffield Chair in Medicine, but he preferred to stay at Harvard. But that also influenced me. I was glad that I got the job because it was the only place I applied to.
That's very fortunate.
Very fortunate.
Were you impressed by the faculty at the Thorndike and the general atmosphere there from the point of view of teaching?
Oh, it was enormously impressive. Of course, Soma Weiss had gone to the Brigham and Chester Kiefer to BU, but still Minot was there. Of course, Bill Castle, Max Finland, Hale Ham, Larry Ellis, and others. And of course, the quality of the house staff was remarkably high. I think that there was a kind of a esprit de corps in the house staff, and the feeling that the Harvard unit had to be the best. That was enormously impressive, a kind of environment in which to work.
Right. I think you served in the Navy Medical Corps during World War II. As a matter of fact, you were in the Marine Corps, and I've heard it said that some people considered that your experience in the Marine Corps was the best preparation you could have had for a deanship at Harvard. What sort of experience was it?
Well, I think it was an interesting experience, and I think that probably it was a useful one. I'd gone into the Navy because I thought that it would be a comfortable place to be. I'd always have a bed to sleep in. I wouldn't have to walk very far. And then after I'd been in and assigned to the V-12 program at Tufts, for about 3 weeks, I got my orders. And my chief asked me to sit down while he read them to me, and he told me that I'd been assigned to the Fleet Marine Force to go to Camp Lejeune, where I underwent essentially boot camp. We used to get up at 4 in the morning and run and do various exercises and try to learn how to get along walking through the swamps.
You still get up at 4 in the morning.
I still get up at 4 in the morning. Well, sometimes till 5. But in any case, I think I did learn something. I think as a battalion surgeon, I was essentially a primary care physician, which was kind of interesting and fun. And I must say I admired the Marines. I never slept on sheets, however. I slept on the ground. But the other thing that was of interest was that at the end of the war, our division occupied Nagasaki. And 2 units had been assigned to study the victims that were still there. one by the Navy and one by the Army, and they were headed by Shields Warren and Stafford Warren, and said they had all of the scientific equipment and all of the lab work, but they didn't have anybody to examine the patient. So a number of us volunteered to do that. We had maps showing the epicenter of where the bomb had been detonated, about 1,600 feet over the ground. And we had concentric circles, so we could identify where people were at the time and measure essentially the distance from the epicenter and the degree of exposure. And we could tell the way they were facing because if they were facing, let's say the bomb was over there, they would have flash burns on that side and epilation if they had enough dose of radiation. And we were able to get medical supplies from the ships and from our own division hospitals, so we were also able to treat them, treat particularly the anemias, infections. I would only make one comment. I think that I would agree with those people who say that nuclear war is a horrible thing. But I think what is sometimes forgotten by people who have not seen war firsthand is that the product of the injuries caused by conventional warfare are equally horrible. If you die or maimed by shrapnel or a flamethrower, it's not much better than being hurt by a nuclear explosion.
Well, having seen a good many war wounds myself, I agree with you. After you were discharged from the Navy, you returned to Chicago and was on the faculty of the medical school there. Tell us a little about that experience.
Well, I returned there partly because we got to get a place to live, and as you know, at that time it was hard to find a place to live. Secondly, I was offered a job as a fellow by Robert Bloch in pulmonary diseases, and I stayed on there then from 1946 to 56. I think in many ways that was the most productive period of my life because, as you know, it was a period of logarithmic growth of academic medicine. It was possible in those days to teach, to do research, to see patients and not feel that one was doing a bad job in one or another of those areas. And I think it's a time that will never quite return, but it was a very enjoyable time.
What were your research interests at that time?
Well, I was interested at that time in first of all, in tuberculosis, because we had a lot of patients with tuberculosis. I was interested in the action of antimicrobial agents, isoniazid and streptomycin and so on. We did a fair number of studies on that. I also was interested we did some studies of tuberculosis in the ear chamber, but then I became interested in the effect of cortisone on infection. And because at the time, you will remember, cortisone was thought it might even be useful in the treatment of infection. But it turned out, of course, and we were able to demonstrate quite dramatically, as did others, is that the impact of cortisone was really a marked suppression of the whole inflammatory response. The vessels which normally would become dilated remain constricted. The adherence of leukocytes to the endothelium, which normally occurred in inflammation, was greatly diminished. And of course, that simply led to a situation in which there was great multiplication of bacteria. So it had you can see why it helped in those inflammatory conditions where inflammation was useless, but not in those where it was helpful.
I know that you had a very productive time at the University of Chicago, but you did decide in 1956 to move to Cleveland, where you became chairman of the Department of Medicine. Could you tell us a bit what motivated your move and how you felt about it?
Well, it was a very difficult decision because I was obviously very happy at the University of Chicago. I had a great many friends, liked what I was doing. The person who recruited me was a man named Joe Wern, who was then the dean. Joe Wern had been at the Thorndike and had been associated with Dr. Peabody when he was the head of the Thorndike, had gone to Western Reserve as the head of medicine and then subsequently became dean. At the end of World War II, it just happened that about 13 departments were, heads of departments had retired, and so he was able to replace all of those, and he replaced them. So very able people, but also people who were interested in a reform of the Western Reserve curriculum. And so it became a very exciting place to go, and I think he was a very persuasive person. So I think that it was because of that environment that I decided to go there.
That was a period when a great many innovations in curriculum were introduced at Western Reserve. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think that of those, perhaps the most significant one was the introduction of students to patients very early on, in the first year. They were putting in touch with families, and they worked with families. They learned how to work with patients, how to interview patients. I think that is an important innovation, and I think has been used by many medical schools. The second was integrated teaching, rather than teaching each discipline as a totally separate discipline. That's important because of particularly what's happened recently with the kind of the unity of basic science. I think the part that wasn't so successful was it became very dependent on lectures. And I think that those places that have adopted the kind of the problem-solving mode and small group teaching have also made important contributions in this area.
Were there some indirect consequences of the experiments in curriculum there?
I think the most important one, basically, Dick, was that the change in the teaching environment. I think teaching environment is enormously important in any kind of educational enterprise. Western Reserve, before this introduction of a new curriculum, had been an area in which there was extreme hostility between faculty and students. Students literally went away, graduates hating the place. They just really couldn't wait to get out of there, and that totally changed. And I think it followed the sort of the Hale-Ham dictum, and Hale-Ham had been brought in to kind of implement this curriculum. It was treating students as colleagues, and I not only observed this directly, but I had a son and daughter-in-law who went there as students, and they confirmed that.
I had a son that went there.
That's right, and I think they all...
I also might mention that it had an impact on teaching in a great many of the medical schools in the United States. It served as a model for a great many curriculum changes, including the ones that we made when I was at the University of Minnesota.
Yeah.
What part of your position did you enjoy most when you were chairman of the Department of Medicine? What sort of activities?
I think that basically, in addition to working with students, and that was always fun, it was working with the house staff. And, we had a very congenial group. We became very competitive in attracting students to the service. And I enjoyed meeting them in the morning report and hearing about the cases that had been admitted. I learned more, I think, than they did, but it was enjoyable. The second thing really was that I developed a program for residents that were interested in going on into academic medicine, and they were supported for 2 years working in a basic science laboratory, and then 2 to 3 years back in the Department of Medicine.
I know that you had some very unusual students there at that time, and house staff. Maybe you might comment on the way they were chosen.
Well, it was a one-man admissions committee. A man named Jack Coy, who had come from Columbia. I think he, by his own description, the longest residency of anybody in internal medicine. But he theoretically had a committee, but he actually chose people. And he did choose an interesting group of people, very often people who would not have been chosen by other schools, older people, people with different kinds of careers and backgrounds. It was an interesting group.
Now, when you were chairman, probably you had to give up some of your previous activities. Did you miss those?
Yes, I particularly missed the direct contact that I had had with patients that I'd had at the University of Chicago. I was able to continue research, but at a somewhat reduced level. But the last year that I was there, I took the year off as a sabbatical and was able to spend full time in the lab. And it was during this time that I'd become interested in the leukocyte as being involved in inflammation, and I was working with a man named John Moses who worked with Elisha Atkins on endogenous pyrogen, and we were able to demonstrate that it also was an endogenous inflammatory agent, and I suspect what we were really working with was leukotriene.
Recently, the position of chairman of the Department of Medicine has become less desirable. In large part, this is due to the change in the nature of the position, particularly the emphasis on financing the department, the necessity for private practice as support of the department. These pressures have interfered with the ability of the chairman to carry out some of the traditional duties such as teaching and research. Did you feel the beginning impact of these changes when you were at Western Reserve?
Yes, and I think that I hadn't realized, I don't think anyone quite realizes the amount of administrative time that one has to spend as a chairman of the department of a large department of medicine. And of course, when I started, it was, compared to what these departments are now, relatively small, but as each division grew and each division became almost the size of a department, the chairman almost became a kind of an orchestrator, and not even an orchestrator often, but really just trying to sort of manage the whole thing.
Hold it together.
Hold it together. I think that I might just comment here too on things that have worried me about academic medicine, and that is the dependence on things for financing that have absolutely nothing to do with teaching. I mean, theoretically, departments are there and medical schools are there to teach medical students and hopefully also to train people at the postgraduate level. But because the support early on, so much of it came from the NIH, really that growth that I talked about earlier really was NIH funding, which was increasing at a rate of 15% a year up until really 1965. And by 1965, something like 55% of the support, of the total support of all the medical schools in the United States came from the NIH. So that was distorted, I think, the mission. The second thing that has distorted, continues, it seems to me, to distort it, is now the enormous dependence on practice income. And that distorts it for two reasons. One is because really the people who are in practice are basically supporting themselves. They're supporting, in addition, other activities, but a lot of it goes to the individual support. But in many ways, I think they have less time for teaching than the old voluntary faculty. Our fathers spent more time teaching for nothing than many full-time people in departments of medicine today. And I think that too, that whole, we've built these enormous kind of departments that are dependent on outside funding, and as I say, having very little or nothing to do with teaching.
I think that before you left Western Reserve, you took off a year simply to spend full time on research.
Yeah.
Did that work out pretty
well?
well?
That worked out very well. Before that, I'd had not very much time. I was lucky to have a couple people working with me, Dr. Kochfaser and Dr. Moses, who I think I mentioned John Moses earlier. But that year was a particularly rewarding one because I really was able to spend full time in the lab. But at the time I started, I hadn't realized I'd be leaving, but I continued on until.
Didn't you do some work on some of the inflammatory mediators?
Yes, I did at that time, and that was the most important thing that we did.
Now, the next stage in your career was your move to Boston and to Harvard. How did this come about? You apparently were very successful at Western Reserve in building the department. I know you were very popular there because I talked to many people that worked with you. You had a pleasant family life there. How did you happen to decide to change to Boston and to Harvard?
Well, I suppose partly it was the prestige of Boston and Harvard. It has a kind of an allure that is hard, I suppose, to define. When I was first asked to be interviewed by the search committee, which incidentally was chaired by Bill Castle, I was flattered, but I didn't think that anything would come of it. But I was enormously flattered when I was offered the job. by George Packer Barry, who assumed that on offering it, I was going to take it anyway. I mean, George didn't really debate with one; he just assumed that, and I did. But I didn't. I was flattered. I also didn't think that I was. I mean, succeeding Walter Bauer was something which I really did with awe because he was such a remarkable man. But there was another reason why I decided to leave that really had nothing to do with that. And that had to do with an experience that I'd had that began in the early '60s. The Meatpackers Union of Cleveland had decided that they wanted to try to develop a prepaid medical plan. And they invited a number of consultants who had all been associated with the Kaiser plan. A man named Avram Yedidia, who had been one of the original architects of the Kaiser Permanente plan, William Stewart, who later became Surgeon General, a man named Richard Weinerman, who later went to Yale as a professor of preventive medicine. And they came to visit me to talk about the potential for admitting patients in the University Hospital on the ward services. And I became intrigued because I really had known very little or nothing about prepaid plan before that, and I became intrigued with it as the potential it might have for teaching. And so I arranged for this group of consultants to meet with the executive committee of the hospital, with all the heads of departments and so on. And we not only met for periods of several hours, but we actually had a couple days retreat to discuss the potential of it. And it was very interesting. I could sense after this had been going for a time that it wasn't going to go anyplace, partly and for very understandable reasons, that the part-time staff worried about competition, and that was completely understandable. But what I hadn't anticipated was that the full-time, the professors, the heads of departments, seemed to be worried about something else. They were worried about since prepaid plan at that time was considered a rather radical departure from fee-for-service medicine and was not, and had been opposed, as you know, by the AMA. It was considered, they worried about what people would think, people outside of Western Reserve and the country at large. So one of the reasons that I decided to go to Harvard was that I knew that Harvard and the teaching hospitals were conservative. That went without saying. But I also knew that it would never occur to them to think that what anybody else thought would matter.
About what things that were done at Harvard.
That's right. Because if they did it, it must be all right. So that was one of the reasons I left.
Well, also, I think for some years there had been a rather liberal group of academic physicians at Harvard who had taken some stands on medical care.
There had Dean Clark at the MGH, certainly the head of pediatrics there, Walter Bauer. Howard Means certainly was a very liberal thinker. And it was very, very interesting that what was the affiliated hospitals later became the Brigham and Women's, had a mission statement, and in that mission statement, which was written in the 50s, there was the suggestion that there be a prepaid plan associated with the affiliated hospitals. And we really, at the beginning, thought that we would develop it in association with the affiliated. I'm glad we didn't wait for the affiliated to be built, because it wasn't built until after I left.
So you went to Harvard as professor of medicine and chief of the medical service at the Massachusetts General Hospital. After a year, you moved into the deanship. Had you known of that possibility when you went there, or was that a surprise?
That was really a surprise. I sort of dimly knew that President Pusey was looking for a dean.
Even then.
Even then, and that Packer Barry was due to retire. But I hadn't really thought much about it, and so it came as a surprise when I was offered the job. I decided, however, to take it because by that time I really had become more interested in some of the social aspects of medicine, and I decided that maybe I could do more about that as the dean than I would be able to as a head of the department. So that's the reason I took it.
And that actually turned out to be true. And you were able then to do two things, as I understand it. One was to set up a faculty devoted to study, scientific study of the sociology of health care, and also to begin to initiate the Harvard Community Plan.
Yes, we established something called the Center for Community Health and Medical Care, which was kind of a joint effort between the medical school and the School of Public Health. We recruited Paul Denson, who was a distinguished epidemiologist, to head it, Rashi Fine, who was one of the outstanding medical economists in the country. And we developed a research program there and also a training program devoted largely to people who had finished all their training in medicine and then wanted to take a couple of years to learn something about some of the social and political aspects and really, I would say, healthcare research, which was in its nascency then because there really was very little going on. But and I think that was quite successful. Indeed, I would say that it was, although I don't think that the people at the Johnson Foundation would ever admit it, but it really became the model for their clinical scholars program.
Well, also, my memory is that it was at one time the intellectual center for the study of healthcare in the United States.
Well, it actually, I think it really was. There is another little anecdote that I might tell. John Dunlop, who was the dean
Yes.
of arts and sciences at that time, and as you know, was a distinguished economist and was the Secretary of Labor and so on. He persuaded me that I ought to try to develop health economics, and that he had one of the answers for me, and that was that there was a very bright young man in the Department of Economics named Martin Feldstein, and why didn't I support his professorship, which I did.
But you did.
Which I did, and most people don't realize that the medical schools paid his salary until he went to Washington.
Really?
Yeah. But actually, he lost interest in health economics.
And then, was it after that or about that time that you began to develop your plan for prepaid medical care?
Well, it was about the same time.
Yeah.
We invited, shortly after I got there, we invited a man named Jerome Pollack up from Columbia to try to develop plans, and we were able to evolve them. I was able to get some grants, the first grant from the Commonwealth Fund, and $500,000 to help develop it. I might just say parenthetically that Harvard knows how to kind of protect its money, because although I got the money from the Commonwealth Fund to support the plan, it was lent to the plan and was paid back to our endowment over time.
What do you mean they got it back?
They got it back. That way you protect your endowment.
Right.
But in any case, at the time we started, and we had a difficult time finding a place to light, we had 60 patients and I think about 20 doctors, and they got the most complete coverage of any group of patients in the world. But in any case, we had some very difficult times financially at the beginning, and I finally got money from a number of insurance companies, from the Rockefeller Foundation and from the Ford Foundation, a loan, and then we got it going.
As I remember, about that time, the insurance companies became interested in prepaid care. Is that correct?
Well, they became interested a little later. We thought that
was later.
We thought they would take it up then, but they didn't. It was later, but they did very much so.
I know at one time one of the representatives from one of the insurance companies contacted me in Minnesota about starting
Yeah.
an HMO
Yeah.
for the medical school.
Yes. Well, we had hoped that it would take off, but and now that it has taken off, we wish it would stop.
Was there much opposition from the clinical faculty to the foundation?
No, there really wasn't. Surprisingly little. I think partly because they didn't think it was going to probably go anyplace, and nobody was really very worried about it being competitive. Secondly, all the people that were originally on the staff were people on the Harvard faculty. We used the teaching hospitals. We, from the beginning, as a part of the mission, and really the statement of the mission was that it was being designed essentially to do teaching and research. And we committed a 1.5% of the premiums to teaching, research, and community service. So there was a kind of a general acceptance of it from the beginning.
Well, now it's grown to great size. Perhaps you might comment on the number of members and the money involved to give an idea of the size. In view of this growth, has that stimulated opposition?
Well, it has now grown to a size which is really, it's about 500,000 members, and it's approaching $1 billion budget a year. It's bigger now than most of the big teaching hospitals. It's associated with the Brigham and Women's. We're responsible for about 1/3 of their admissions. So it has a presence that now, when we first established a center in Wellesley, there was a good deal of opposition because there were a good many practicing physicians there, and they opposed it.
And
but
that's
since then,
more or less society practice.
That's right. But since then, it's pretty well died down. We really, though, I think, have been successful in the original academic mission. We have a very strong teaching program. Our introduction to the clinic has been used as a kind of a model for the rest of the medical school. We have a joint program with Gene Brownwald of training of primary care residents at the Brigham and Women's. We train people in ambulatory psychiatry, a whole variety of programs that have been very successful. Research has been a little slower, but it's now growing in amount. And the most important development recently has been the decision by the medical school to establish the department, a really reconstituted Department of Preventive Medicine and ambulatory practice at the plan. And the new chairman of that is just being selected.
Is it tied in with this group of health economists?
Well,
healthcare economists?
Well, not really. That has kind of diminished.
I see.
It still exists, but not with the force it had before.
I see. Well, of course, the times have changed.
Times have changed,
They've
and
since
there are many other things that are going on.
And they've accomplished their mission to some extent. Does the plan still maintain its close relationship with the teaching hospitals?
Yes, although because of its size now and because we've spread out, we also use community hospitals. But we still, the major hospital we use is the Brigham and Women's, the teaching hospital. We also use the BI and the children's and so on.
You've mentioned your accomplishments as dean in terms of founding the health plan and then developing a scholarly approach to health care and healthcare economics. Perhaps we could discuss some of the other aspects of your deanship. I know that changes in medical education occurred, and also Harvard has become the dominant institution, I should say the dominant university in medical research in the United States. I don't think there's any question about that. In fact, at least from my standpoint, they've left the other major institutions behind.
Yes.
Was that occurring during your tenure or beginning?
It was certainly beginning at that time, and I think that we were able to develop, for example, the first major department of neurobiology with a man named Steve Kupfler as the head of it, and we were supporting more and more research and very fundamental research in the hospitals. I think that there was an advantage that Harvard had in that it wasn't so apparent to the outside world that Harvard was getting that much money because a lot of it went directly to the teaching hospitals. But yes, that was building at the time.
I think the outside world gets the picture.
Yeah, they know. They maybe do it, but it's hard to count up.
Yeah. So that this expansion of medical research, or shift actually of medical research towards Harvard as a major research university was beginning at that time.
Really, yes, very much so.
I don't think, have you mentioned the relationship with Massachusetts Institute of Technology?
No, that was an interesting one. at the time shortly after I got there, and Jerry Wiesner had become president of MIT, he had been approached by Shannon, who then was head of the NIH, to start a medical school at MIT, and was told that if he would start one, that Shannon would be able to mobilize $50 million to start it. At the same time, I was being approached by David Rutstein and other members of the Faculty of Medicine to start a Department of Bioengineering. One evening at Leona Baumgartner's home, Jerry Wiesner and I happened to sit together, and we were talking about our mutual problems, and he was telling me that he really couldn't afford to start a medical school, and I was telling him I couldn't afford to start a Department of Bioengineering, but then it occurred to us that if we combined forces, we could do both. So we established a committee to look into the possibility of putting together a joint program, which then became the so-called health science and technology program of Harvard and MIT. 25 students a year are selected for that program. They've been some of the most outstanding students that have come into the medical school. I would say that they have the largest group of go on to MD, PhD programs of any group in the medical school. So it's been very successful.
Do you want to mention a word or two about the curriculum and teaching there while you were there?
Well, I think that there were changes in the curriculum. In fact, it was said that by Dave Fryman, who was the chairman of the curriculum committee, as he looked back at the history of the curriculum change in the medical school, that it changed every 7 years, and we were right on target. I would say that during my tenure that I don't think we made the significant changes that have come about subsequently. I think only the HST program, which essentially was perhaps the prototype for the societies that Dan Tossison has developed, but I think he really has made some very substantial changes.
You were at Harvard at the time when there was this major disturbance among young people in schools in the late 60s and 70s. Did that impact on Harvard Medical School?
It did. I think it made me surprising to some that this remote school would be involved. But one of the cause célèbre of the group that was occupying University Hall was the fact that the medical school was going to displace poor people from housing to build a hospital for rich people, namely the Brigham and Women's. And so I spent the next year or two talking to radical medical students, communities, people, disturbed trustees, and so on. So I was very much involved. The other thing, of course, that came out of that I think was very good was that you remember the assassination of Martin Luther King. And at that time, we did expand the number of minority students going to the school, and that's been sustained.
Do you want to say a few words about what you've done since you retired from
Well, since that time,
Dean of
I've
Harvard?
continued my interest in social aspects of medicine. I worked as a consultant for a number of foundations, and have thought about some of the problems of medicine and medical education. I think that medicine is really in a substantial crisis today. I've been saying that for 20 years, so I ought to know. But I think it's becoming increasingly apparent. In part, a lot of that has come about because of the absolutely remarkable success of academic medicine and the development of the technologies that have gone with it. But if you look at the fact that by the year 2000, with the present projections of inflation of medical care costs, that by the year 2000 we will be spending $1.7 trillion. We both know that we've become over-specialized, and that primary care is the orphan of academic health centers. And now small companies can't afford health insurance. The large corporate world is worried. So I think we're in big trouble.
I think we all are aware of that, and we hope that you continue an interest in health care, and look forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you.